From the game of mystery bags to America's nightmare. Let me tell you, if you've ever found yourself drawn to the little thrill of buying a mystery bag, those colorful, sealed pouches that promise a random toy, odd gadget, or quirky trinket, you're not alone. This quirky game has passed through generations of American kids and college students, offering that rare moment of heart-thumping excitement. What's inside? A harmless prank? A windfall? Maybe just some candy? Honestly, I used to be captivated by the anticipation, never guessing that the very feeling of opening the unknown could echo so chillingly in American history. That innocent excitement at its core taps into something universal. People have always had a complex relationship with surprise. It's the mixture of hope and anxiety that, in the right context, feels harmless, even joyful. For many, the unopened mystery bag symbolizes optimism and play. But in the dark corners of the human psyche, that same anticipation can trigger dread. What happens when, instead of a toy or a candy bar, the surprise is something lethal? That's the question that would soon grip the United States, transforming harmless curiosity into widespread paranoia. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a strange, nervous era in America. Payphones still lined city blocks. College campuses overflowed with students excited by the possibilities of technology and freedom. In those days, opening your mailbox was an everyday pleasure. The idea that something sinister might lurk among the flyers and bills was almost unthinkable. Yet, it was precisely this innocence that paved the way for the most notorious campaign of terror by mail the US would ever see. You see, before the word Unabomber became shorthand for fear, the idea that a package, wrapped in brown paper and string, left unattended in a hallway or on a front porch, could upend your life, or end it, simply didn't cross people's minds. That would all change with a bang, when a seemingly innocuous package landed on the desk of a well-respected professor in Chicago. Suddenly, the custom of exchanging gifts and surprises, what was once a game of joy, was weaponized in the most horrifying way. The trust that came with every unexpected box or letter was shattered, replaced by a collective anxiety that would haunt the country for years. This is where the line between a playful mystery and an existential threat blurred, and the entire notion of anticipation itself was forever contaminated for a whole nation. What once was a delightful game, the mystery bag, became a living metaphor for a new, more frightening America. The first shock, the mysterious parcel in Chicago. It was a crisp morning on May 25, 1978, when Professor Paul Griswold, a respected faculty member in the Department of Materials Engineering at Northwestern University, noticed an unassuming parcel waiting on his office desk. The return address? University of Illinois, a familiar institution, but what made it odd was that the sender's name matched his own. Paul blinked in surprise. Had his mind played tricks on him? Was this some administrative mix-up or maybe a prank by a mischievous student? What most didn't know was that the package's journey had already tangled in confusion. It was first discovered in the parking area at University of Illinois. With nobody able to identify a recipient, the staff called the delivery company, who, by default, returned it to the sender. That sender, according to the tag, was Professor Griswold himself, though he had no recollection of mailing anything. Much as curiosity itched at him, years of academic caution and urban legends about college pranks made Paul wary. Instead of opening the box himself, he called over Terry Marks, a campus security officer, and explained the strange situation. Terry, younger and perhaps more optimistic, shrugged off Paul's warning. "It's probably just some student pulling a fast one," he grinned, clearly amused by the possibility of a harmless joke. He jiggled the parcel, felt its weight, and without hesitation, began to peel back the wrapping. The sequence that followed defied all expectations. A harsh bang tore through the stillness of the room. In an instant, the package detonated, sending shards, smoke, and panic echoing down the university hallways. Miraculously, the bomb's power wasn't fatal. Though Terry was injured, he survived, thanks to quick-thinking colleagues who dialed for emergency services. Yet the shock ran deeper than the physical wounds. When law enforcement arrived, they were met with a riddle. The package, now blown to bits, left no fingerprints or identifiable traces. The addressee didn't exist, and the sender was the victim himself. It was classic misdirection, and a nightmare for investigators who already juggled a skyrocketing crime rate in urban Chicago. Maybe it would have ended there, dismissed as just another weird campus prank, in a city numb from daily dangers. But as images of the smoke-filled office spread through the academic grapevine, a gnawing fear began to creep in. Even when the case file quietly slipped toward the bottom of the pile, low priority due to a lack of fatalities or leads, a seed was planted. What if this wasn't an accident? What if the game was rigged and danger was now being delivered through one of the most innocent devices in American life, the mail? No one in Chicago yet realized how this single parcel would become the first domino in a twisted chain, setting the stage for a decade of terror and shaking America's trust to its foundation. The nightmare unfolds. The next bomb rocks a college campus. If you thought the first explosion was just a freak event, the city of Chicago had barely begun to let out a sigh of relief before trouble struck again. 1 year after that terrifying morning in Northwestern when the scent of burnt paper and singed carpet still lingered in the memories of faculty and staff, fate delivered its next blow, this time with cruel familiarity but heightened dread. On an otherwise mild spring day, John Harris, a young and well-liked graduate student hustling through exams and research deadlines, found his plans vastly disrupted. He'd been helping his advisor organize stacks of academic reports and end-of-semester papers when, almost comically, he stumbled over a peculiar package left beside a file cabinet in one of the university's bustling corridors. The box was average in size, nondescript, taping a little loose at the corners as if someone had been unsure or in a hurry. There was no card, no warm wishes, just that universal label, John Harris, handwritten in careful, neat script. Curiosity tugged at John's sleeve, as it did for any student faced with an unsolicited package. Was this from a secret admirer or maybe an academic publisher, he joked with a colleague passing by. The room was light with laughter. After all, this was a place of learning first, not of doom and gloom. John crouched, lifted the box, and as he shifted it out of the way, it slipped from his hands, landing with a harsh thud. What happened next forever altered not just his own life, but also the very heartbeat of an American institution that took great pride in being open and accessible. The package exploded upon impact. The blast sent shards splintering into the desk, tore through notes and thesis drafts, and billowed smoke down adjoining hallways. Somewhere, someone screamed. In the confusion and chaos, John was dragged from the room, blood covering the front of his shirt, his glasses shattered. Miraculously, John survived. Quick action from classmates who had recently attended emergency training saved him from suffering far worse than burns and shrapnel wounds. Paramedics rolled him away as campus police cordoned off the site. For the faculty, students and neighbors who heard the news, the initial shock doubled into outright panic. Was this truly just an isolated copycat stunt? Or the methodical work of a calculated mind with a vendetta against their school? In the aftermath, detectives canvassed the school for witnesses, and news vans swarmed the main quad, feeding a sense of dread that was hard to shake. Professors debated whether to postpone classes. Rumors ran rampant. Was someone targeting the engineering department? Were random students next? The usually serene flow of campus life slowed as people peered into their mail slots with suspicion and jumped whenever the intercom buzzed in their building. For the first time, administrators began quietly tightening mail security and warning staff to report anything unusual. At the heart of it all, Chicago law enforcement faced a wall of frustration. For the second time, crucial forensic clues had been vaporized or blown beyond recognition. No fingerprints, no reliable witnesses, no clear motive. Sure, nobody had died, not yet, but the message booming through the silence was clear. The danger was real, and the next victim could be anyone. As the media spun up speculation, the story spread. The safe, academic world had been breached by an invisible threat, and Chicago was only beginning to understand the scope of the nightmare that had slipped in through their mailboxes. The danger spreads, a phantom at 33,000 feet. The nightmare didn't stop with college campuses. In 1979, the terror leapt from the academic world onto an even more daunting stage, the skies above America. Suddenly, what had once seemed an isolated threat now threatened to bring panic to the nation's airports and thousands of unsuspecting flyers. This marked a chilling escalation. The Unabomber, whoever they were, was not just targeting individuals tucked away in university offices, but now, potentially, hundreds of innocents trapped in a pressurized metal tube hurtling through the air at 33,000 feet. It was an ordinary spring morning, routine, even boring, aboard American Airlines Flight 444, en route from Chicago to Washington, D.C. Passengers sipped coffee and dozed, flight attendants pushed their carts of sodas and pretzels, and nobody could imagine that only a thin sheet of metal separated them from disaster. That changed dramatically when, deep in the cargo hold, a nearly imperceptible chemical smell began to seep through crevices. Some of the ground crew noticed it, a sharp, acrid tang not easily identified. The alert grew quickly. Flight staff, on edge due to nationwide increased awareness of random acts of violence, called for an immediate inspection. The discovery was as horrifying as it was unexpected. Hidden among the suitcases beneath layers of bags and tags was an unassuming brown package. It might have been just another forgotten birthday gift or a box of rare books, except for the odd wiring and crude homemade battery visible when baggage handlers carefully prodded it. Within minutes, authorities confirmed this was a bomb. Emergency protocols kicked in. The pilot wasted no time in radioing for a priority landing. Passengers were told only there was a technical malfunction, but tension in the cabin grew as the plane dropped altitude fast, and flight attendants stowed away their carts with frenzied precision. By the time the aircraft screeched to a halt on the tarmac, emergency services were on site, and the terminal was in lockdown mode. Explosives technicians scoured the hold and gingerly removed the device, hearts pounding behind their blast shields. What sent shivers down everyone's spine afterward was the verdict. The bomb had failed to detonate not through any act of mercy, but because of a malfunction in the wiring. It was a matter of pure luck, of fate, of wires crossed or switches jammed that saved the lives of everyone on board. An entire airplane full of strangers who, for a brief moment, unknowingly stared death in the face. The FBI, joining the investigation immediately, determined that the chemical composition and construction of the bomb closely matched those used in prior campus incidents. A clear signature that these random-seeming acts weren't random at all. It was a chilling message. If America had felt safe in the skies before, those days were over. The story spread like wildfire across the morning news and through neighborhood whispers. Parents clung to their children a little tighter, and business travelers scanned the faces of strangers at airports, eyeing every package and duffel bag with suspicion. In Washington, lawmakers received confidential briefings they'd hoped never to hear. A serial bomber was on the move, and every innocent-seeming parcel might hide disaster. The ghosts of vanished safety quietly haunted the entire country, cruising above cornfields, city blocks, and muddy valleys in the belly of a plane. The Unabomber had officially taken his terror to the national stage, and there was no telling where he'd strike next. The case spreads beyond academia, the airline presidents brush with death. You'd think after a bomb almost brought down an entire commercial airliner that terror had already stretched itself to the limit. But late 1979, just as investigators and the entire country scrambled to make sense of it all, the threat spilled out of the academic world and straight into the world of high-powered industry. The target? Percy Wood, president of United Airlines. Percy Wood was not your typical corporate suit. The son of a coal miner from southern Illinois, he worked his way up through a steel toughness and little tolerance for nonsense. By the time he took the helm at United, aviation was booming, airports bustled, and the future felt wide open above the clouds, at least on the surface. Wood's job was anything but routine, juggling labor negotiations one day and fielding government scrutiny the next. But nothing had prepared him for the anonymous brown package that landed on his doorstep in the summer of 1980. This particular morning, Wood's home in the cozy suburb of Lake Forest, Illinois, felt, for once, peaceful. He was enjoying bacon and eggs, absently flipping through industry journals when the doorbell chimed with a postal worker's familiar knock. The package was no different than 100 he'd received before, nondescript, almost forgettable. If he noticed anything odd at all, it might have been the strange, firm way the address was typed out, or the way the corners of the box were sealed tightly, as if the sender wanted absolutely nothing to sneak out. He set it aside at first, chalking it up to another book club subscription or some new technical manual. That evening his curiosity finally won out. Percy settled into his den, sliced through the tape, and the world exploded. Literally. To this day, police technicians marvel that Percy survived. The device was crude, yes, but ingeniously designed to trigger the instant the box was disturbed. Shrapnel tore through his hands and face, splintering the tranquility of his upscale suburban street. It was only through sheer luck and quick first aid from his wife, who'd heard the blast and rushed in screaming, that Wood's life was spared. Sheer chaos ensued, neighbors flooding the lawn, police cruisers barricading the street, men in bomb suits combing the wreckage. For Percy Wood, whose only mistake had been, in a sense, getting to the top of his field, life would never return to normal. Shrapnel would be picked from his skin for months, and the vision in one eye was never quite the same. Yet perhaps the greatest wound was psychological, the sense that nowhere was safe, no station or title a shield against random, calculated malice. In the weeks after the attack, Wood's mailbox became a thing of dread. Security details shadowed him 24/7, while his family fielded anxious calls from relatives and colleagues nationwide. If the bombings of university staff had unsettled the intellectual class, this attack set off sirens in the world of business and government. Suddenly, the Unabomber's reach, for that was the moniker the media now adopted, short for university and airline bomber, seemed limitless. Newsroom phones rang off the hook. The FBI, now formally leading a full-scale manhunt, briefed executives at every major airline. Federal aviation authorities issued confidential advisories that ran like wildfire throughout the industry. Scan all incoming shipments, report every suspicious parcel, question every unexpected knock at the door. Meanwhile, the FBI's behavior science unit pored over the new evidence with a bitter sense of déjà vu. The bomb's construction echoed the devices from earlier strikes, homemade, bizarrely sophisticated for materials so commonplace. Bits of sawdust and grain husk, a scrap of wood used as an arming device, household batteries. There was an unsettling brilliance at play here. Whoever crafted these deadly parcels understood not only chemistry and electronics, but also the pulse of human systems. University mailrooms, airline executive towers, suburban rituals of routine, trust, and curiosity. Detectives chased 1,000 dead ends. Was the bomber a vengeful employee, fired or slighted by United Airlines? Wood could think of plenty of dissatisfied pilots or union reps, but none this psychotic. Or was it random, an extrapolation of the academic attacks, now made personal? The Unabomber's motivations grew more inscrutable with every package. And when police sifted through the charred remains, they found a book tucked deep inside, Ice Brothers, by Sloan Wilson. Wood's secretary recalled nothing like it ever being on his order list. Ice Brothers was a story of two men, Paul and Nathan, weathering storms aboard a U.S. Coast Guard patrol vessel during World War II. To some, its presence was a red herring. To others, a clue. FBI profilers suspected the sender had an obsession with the environment or felt out of sync with modern technology and bureaucracy, given previous attack themes. At the same time, the mention of harrowing survival and icy isolation mirrored the psychological wilderness this mysterious figure was inflicting upon the country. In the aftermath, the sense of menace ballooned out from the elite to the everyday. Airline boardrooms doubled their precautions, sure, but so did small business owners and stay-at-home parents. Newspaper headlines screamed warnings, local talk radio buzzed with theories. The Unabomber had proven that no one, not even a millionaire CEO living in fortress-like comfort, was insulated from the reach of fear. For the first time, there was open talk of terrorism not as something foreign or abstract, but as a homegrown specter that could slip in with the morning mail, cheap batteries, and an innocuous book. As the summer passed, the country's distrust deepened. The Unabomber became both a myth and a challenge, with copycats and pranksters sending hoax packages to airlines, universities, and newsrooms. The FBI rushed to examine them, stretching resources thin. Some called it hysteria, but for Percy Wood and his family, the anxiety was real, raw, and reshaping their daily existence. The attack on United Airlines president marked a new era. The Unabomber was no longer a phantom in the halls of academia, but a terror that could hit any zip code, any walk of life. And as the investigation swelled, drawing in hundreds of agents and millions of dollars in resources, America's longing for certainty and for safety in its routines faded just a little more. The evil villain, an unpredictable genius. When it comes to criminal masterminds, few have managed to both terrify and baffle law enforcement the way this particular figure did. America, gripped by a sense of vulnerability, couldn't yet comprehend the intellect and eccentricity of the person behind a campaign of fear that was as methodically brilliant as it was deeply disturbing. This was not a villain of standard mold. This was a trickster, an obsessive, a recluse who moved unseen yet commanded untold chaos with nothing but patience and sheer ingenuity. The FBI's Unabomb task force, formed in mounting desperation, quickly realized that they were not dealing with an average criminal. The bombs that appeared in mailboxes from Chicago to Sacramento were never identical. Unlike most bombers who rely on standard explosives easily recognized by forensic labs, this offender built devices with an artisan's precision and a scientist's creativity. They were tactile puzzles wrapped in riddles, made almost entirely from scrap and household detritus, carved wooden parts, nails collected from old furniture, scraps of rubber, bits of wire painstakingly wound by hand. In place of mass-produced chemicals, the devices often contained home-ground powder, wild sawdust, and sometimes even agricultural byproducts like rice husk, amateurish at first glance but upon closer inspection, maddeningly sophisticated and almost untraceable. Forensic investigators were used to finding wires and triggers with clear origins, maybe even a latent fingerprint if luck was on their side. Here, any trace of the maker seemed deliberately erased. Each device was sanded and cleaned, the tape used was often handled with gloves or wiped clean. The only clues left behind were almost like a smirk at the authorities: abstract sketches, short cryptic notes, and in one bomb, a folded slip of paper scrawled only with the letters FC. What did it mean? Freedom Club? A personal code? Or simply another cruel distraction designed to torment the investigators? At one point, even the books included in the parcels became a focus. When United Airlines President Percy Wood survived an attack, his face forever marked by shrapnel, investigators found, hidden inside the package, a copy of Ice Brothers, a novel about two men battling both the forces of nature and their own despair on a U.S. Coast Guard ship. Was the sender making a statement? Was there a message in the battered pages? Or was it another psychological play to lure detectives down a rabbit hole? The FBI's criminal profilers spent leaden nights shuffling through literary analysis, and for once media pundits and true crime enthusiasts agreed. This perpetrator was playing an entirely different game. What's perhaps most astonishing is just how closely the bomber tracked the investigation, adapting and shifting tactics as the net tightened. When the FBI concentrated on chemicals, the devices turned increasingly mechanical. When they started zeroing in on specific patterns, the bombs changed in both composition and target. Sometimes a parcel would surface with unusually intricate locks, a clear taunt to bomb disposal teams. Other times, notes tucked inside showed a deep familiarity not just with the technical language of chemistry and electronics, but with philosophy, literature, and radical political theory. That last clue would prove crucial. Internal FBI memos and behavioral analysts began to speculate they were facing not only a technical whiz, but also an academic, a person at home in the stacks of a university library, possibly even a former professor or graduate student driven off course by ideological obsession. The erratic targeting confused everyone, but a pattern began to coalesce: academics, engineers, airline executives, and researchers, people at the intersection of modern industry and technology. It was as though the shadowy figure behind the chaos wasn't just lashing out randomly, but striking at what he perceived as the heart of America's technological advance. For law enforcement, the psychological duel became as grueling as the forensics. Each misdirection felt personal. Each new device, delivered to an office, a campus mailroom, or a suburban front porch, was like a letter from an adversary who refused to show their face but demanded to be recognized and understood. Calls poured in from would-be sleuths, conspiracy theorists, university deans, and frightened members of the public, all convinced they had the missing puzzle piece. Yet the true perpetrator remained steps ahead, even as the task force ballooned to over 100 agents. The anxiety was only heightened by the knowledge that the bomber's homemade arsenal was so effective and so deliberately insulated from detection that it could be assembled in a garden shed with materials bought from any corner hardware store. The intelligence was staggering: blueprints, diagrams, and notes, some of which would be discovered only years later, revealed a mind that seemed to occupy itself not only with explosive chemistry, but also with lessons in anti-forensic strategy, misdirection, and psychological manipulation. Whoever this was, he was reading press coverage obsessively, possibly even corresponding under false names with academic journals and engineering magazines. His interests ranged from mathematics to linguistics, environmental activism to social philosophy. The first criminal profile to emerge was unlike anything the FBI had previously encountered. Here was someone with a background rooted in higher education, perhaps even a doctoral pedigree. He was likely male, bookish, socially withdrawn, and, most unsettling of all, a person who truly believed in a cause, no matter how deranged. The partial clues, from sawdust found under a fingernail to coated scraps buried in bomb fragments, pointed to a person both technically brilliant and emotionally isolated. A sense of grudge against modern society hovered over each crime, but the exact motive slipped through the fingers of even the most experienced agents. It soon became common knowledge among agents that they were chasing a ghost, one so disciplined and so eerily removed from the pleasures and pain of ordinary life that he could wait months, even years, between strikes, planning each with a patience that bordered on fanatical. To the media and public, the figure became a bogeyman, a code word for unknowable evil. But inside the FBI, a grudging respect grew alongside the anxiety. This criminal, despite everything, was a genius, the kind who comes along perhaps once in a lifetime, bending the rules of the hunt to his own twisted logic. The question was no longer just how he did it, but why, and whether anyone, anywhere, could ever be safe until he was unmasked. The curse of the unsolved case, a nation haunted by shadows. By the early 1980s, what had once seemed like isolated flashes of violence was mutating into a deeply unsettling national pattern. The Unabomber had shattered any illusion that terror could be quarantined within the ivory towers of academia or the realm of high-profile executives. Death and destruction spread like dark ink across a map. Explosions erupted in Utah, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and California. Each new bombing, whether it injured or killed, seemed to come from nowhere, striking with a randomness that defied all logic. Yet beneath the surface, an insidious pattern was forming, a sickening sense that these attacks were not random at all, but the calculated moves of a specter who could not be caught. FBI special agents lost sleep over maps covered in color-coded pins, each pin another victim of male-born terror. Their task force ballooned to over 100 members, behavioral analysts, bomb experts, field agents, forensic linguists, and criminal profilers. But even with a bureaucracy mobilized at full tilt, progress was painfully slow. The killer left precious little behind. His bombs were Frankenstein creations, cobbled together with such care that no component could be traced to any specific retailer. Wires were stripped of factory markings, batteries bought by the dozen from nondescript stores, wooden parts carved by hand with razor-sharp precision, then sanded clean of fingerprints. Some devices contained homemade black powder ground from ingredients that could be purchased anywhere between Oklahoma and Oregon. Aside from a handful of cryptic FC notations, there was little in the way of communication or motive. Detectives and profilers tried desperately to draw connections between victims, college professors, computer store owners, airline executives, researchers, even a young computer rental shop employee, but time and again, their efforts were stymied by the attackers' baffling selection. There was no clear demographic, political, or ethnic thread. Was this the work of a disgruntled former academic? A technophobic zealot out to punish the architects of a digital revolution he loathed? Or simply a sadist with an anarchic sense of theater and the patience of a spider? Each theory only seemed to reinforce how little investigators truly understood. As years ticked by, the Unabomber's campaign grew even more frightening for its unpredictability. Bombs would arrive unannounced, often at homes or offices of professors who'd never even heard rumors about the case, until fragments of shrapnel or blurred headlines changed their lives forever. Survivors bore scars not just on their bodies, but in their daily routines. A single ring from the mailman could tighten throats with panic, and routine trips to the mailbox took on a ritualistic tension. Neighborhoods once defined by friendliness and trust became dense with suspicion. Children were warned never to touch packages, and office mailrooms wrestled with paranoia, at times quarantining even innocuous-looking deliveries. The Unabomber seemed to revel in this climate of fear, his strikes opening a wound in the collective American consciousness that festered with every new anniversary. News broadcasts ran chilling retrospectives after each attack. Talk radio turned into hotbeds of wild speculation and amateur sleuthing. Articles revisited each bombing victim's story in lurid detail, the grainy photographs and quotes reminding the public how a single act of violence could dismantle safety nets on the most mundane of days. For the targets who survived, media attention was a double-edged sword. Some craved answers, others recoiled at the reminder that their trauma was now a matter of public fascination. But the biggest source of agony, for investigators, victims, and the American people, was the feeling of utter powerlessness. With every passing month it became clearer that the Unabomber was not someone who could be pressured by time or media attention. Where so many serial criminals grow reckless and make mistakes, he only seemed to become more shrewd, more insulated. He left no usable DNA, never allowed himself to be caught on tape or in a compromising position. The few leads, odd vehicle sightings or a flash of a hooded figure, withered on the vine. Agents fanned out across the country, knocking on doors, cold-calling old professors, chasing down anyone remotely eccentric or anti-technology, but the net always came back empty. In the face of such futility, the Unabomber case attained a mythic quality. At FBI headquarters, the investigation board nicknamed the killer the Ghost, a name whispered with a peculiar mix of admiration and exhaustion. Older agents watched younger ones crack under the pressure, their optimism ground down by months of dead ends and fruitless stakeouts. Some began to view the case almost superstitiously, as if the Unabomber was not just a criminal but a curse. Proof that, for all their resources and expertise, some mysteries simply resisted human solution. This feeling bled into the greater culture. The Unabomber's campaign became a kind of dark legend, referenced in thriller novels and metaphors for runaway paranoia. Late-night hosts joked nervously about checking your mailbox twice, and the joke was always received with unease. Psychology journals cited the Unabomber effect as shorthand for a broad loss of public trust in institutions, the government, postal service, the promise of technological progress itself. Whole neighborhoods organized ad hoc safety patrols, while mail carriers took to wearing gloves and pressing management for hazard training. The terror also stoked divisions among law enforcement. Local police criticized federal overreach and the slow rollout of resources. Big city bureaus blamed small-town departments for not spotting patterns early. The media, too, fed the volatility. Accusations of governmental incompetence, sensationalism about the faceless madman lurking in American society, and armchair profiling that often turned xenophobic or needlessly alarmist. One columnist wrote, "We have met the enemy and he is the postman." It felt hyperbolic, until another bomb went off. Perhaps most haunting was the realization that the Unabomber could strike anywhere and everywhere. Unlike traditional adversaries, bank robbers, gangs, political extremists, he exhibited no loyalty, accepted no credit, and showed no personal signature outside his tools of terror. His unpredictability and patience rendered standard strategies powerless. He watched from the dark, always one step ahead, shaping his legend with every unanswered question, every family torn apart by a parcel, every investigator driven to obsession by the curse of the unsolvable. The spread of fear, how America changed its way of life. It's hard to overstate just how profoundly the shadow of the Unabomber altered the American psyche. Before this era of uncertainty, most Americans viewed their daily routines, receiving the mail, commuting to campus, or attending a conference at a tech company, as simple, even comforting rituals. The mailbox was a fixture of trust, a link between friends, families, and dreams. But as news reports of mysterious exploding packages mushroomed, that sense of comfort began to erode, replaced by suspicion, hypervigilance, and institutional anxiety on a scale the country had not seen since wartime. In suburban neighborhoods, the clang of the mailbox no longer brought a flurry of anticipation for greeting cards or catalogs. It provoked a fleeting dread, a silent calculation. Was today the day the unknown would arrive at their doorstep? Elderly couples would sometimes send their grandchildren to fetch the mail with instructions not to touch unfamiliar parcels, while single parents eyed brown boxes with unspoken wariness. In apartment buildings and dormitories, tenants developed new codes: look first, never open someone else's package, and report anything that looked off to the superintendent, just in case. Mailmen, the once unseen backbone of daily American life, became frontline soldiers in a psychological battle they had never signed up for. Some adopted gloves, others simply went slower, inspecting return addresses as if sifting for gold. Institutions were quick to adapt. University mailrooms, previously dismissed as humble, cluttered spaces, quietly became the most secured areas on campus. Signs reading "Report all suspicious packages" dotted hallway walls, stapled next to emergency protocols and campus maps. Staff attended workshops on what a homemade bomb might look like, learned to spot irregularities in handwriting or tape marks, and fielded questions from students who now eyed intercampus deliveries with a kind of cold suspicion. The simple joy of receiving a care package turned into a tense ritual. Some even cut open boxes from a distance, with gloves, their hearts pounding as they did so. Beyond schools, even Fortune 500 companies and government buildings had to revisit every step of their mail handling procedures. Paranoia became policy. Security contractors were brought in to train receptionists, executives, and custodians. Rooms were designated for isolating suspect packages. Some firms quietly began using third-party screening services, sending all incoming material to off-site locations equipped with X-rays and bomb-sniffing dogs. Daily routines developed bottlenecks as people waited for the all-clear before entering their own office suite. The personal cost was deeper than inconvenience or even fear. It was a kind of collective grieving for the loss of innocence. Americans, so used to openness in public spaces, now found themselves policing not only their own routines but those of others. Neighbors grew distrustful, their small talk laced with rumors and what could-bes. Reports of unrelated hoaxes, abandoned bags, or harmless misdeliveries occasionally triggered massive evacuations, paralyzing schools and city blocks for hours. This culture of vigilance blurred boundaries between private and public life. Parents now thought twice about allowing kids to walk unsupervised to the corner mailbox. Local police departments broadcasted PSAs on radio and TV instructing citizens to leave all unmarked packages untouched and to call authorities immediately. Television shows incorporated mail bomb scares into their plots, fueling a cycle of fear that, while sometimes bordering on hysteria, could not be discounted as irrational given the ongoing reality. Arguably the most profound shift was in the American attitude toward trust in their systems, in strangers, and even in technology. People who once joked about junk mail now understood it could be a life-or-death matter. Companies manufacturing envelopes and postal supplies began advertising tamper-proof seals and reinforced mailers. Innovations in mail scanning grew overnight, ushering in a new sub-industry dedicated solely to managing threats that, just years prior, would have seemed more at home in spy novels. Even after packages stopped detonating and the Unabomber finally faded from headlines, the patterns of suspicion and caution lingered. Mailboxes remained symbols of both community and vulnerability. Airport security, already heightened after the discoveries of bombs and cargo, implemented new checks not just for passengers but for every crate and tube. Generations of children who grew up in this era learned to second-guess surprise gifts and to value awareness over unbridled curiosity. Family conversations about stranger danger now included entire modules about mail and anonymous parcels. Looking back, this period was a slow-motion cultural earthquake, subtly shifting the foundations of how a nation saw itself. America grew older, warier, and in some ways a bit lonelier in its routines. Gone was the blithe confidence in community and benign surprise. In its place was a more complicated and perhaps necessary vigilance. And even as new threats emerged in later years, the lessons of the Unabomber era would remain etched in the country's everyday actions, quiet reminders of how quickly innocence, once broken, changes the habits of an entire society. The first portrait emerges, catching a glimpse of the Unabomber. For years, the mysterious bomber known only by his FBI codename, Unabomber, seemed less like a physical person and more like a spectral force. He was a rumor that fueled hushed conversations in campus lounges, a headline that robbed suburban mornings of their comfort, and a ghost that haunted post offices, loading docks, and faculty mailrooms across America. The greatest frustration for law enforcement and for a nation on edge was just how little anyone actually knew about what, or who, they were up against. Everything was shrouded in uncertainty. No one had seen the person behind the deadly parcels, and every clue he left seemed calculated, elusive, or possibly planted to mislead. But in the spring of 1987, amid this fog of mystery and mounting public hysteria, something extraordinary finally happened. An eyewitness appeared. It was in retrospect almost eerily ordinary. One quiet day, just before yet another infernal device detonated outside a computer store in Salt Lake City, Utah, a store manager named Gary Wright noticed a man lingering by the parking lot's vending machine. Nothing about the stranger initially screamed criminal. He was average height, wiry, wearing aviator sunglasses and a dark hooded sweatshirt. Nevertheless, something about his manner struck Gary as odd. He seemed nervous, fidgety, and, most of all, careful about being seen. Not suspicious enough to call the police maybe, but just disagreeable enough to make Wright take note. Moments later, as Gary went toward a piece of lumber oddly lying in the lot, later revealed to be part of a bomb disguised as a wooden block, the device exploded, sending shrapnel into his arm and face. Miraculously, he survived, but in his trauma, he retained something no one else in the entire investigation had managed to secure, a memory of the person who'd left lethal danger in plain sight. This apparent breakthrough was seismic for the investigation. During his recovery, Wright worked tirelessly with a forensic artist. Through hours of painstaking discussion, they reconstructed the image that would go on to be splashed across newspapers, evening broadcasts, and post office walls, a lean, white male in dark wraparound glasses, cascading hair beneath a hoodie, lips pursed in a peculiar way, and a jaw set with an almost philosophical determination. This, for the first time, gave both public and police something tangible, a face, however stylized, to focus their gnawing anxiety upon. But this composite sketch, crude, haunting, somehow both everyman and nobody, was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it electrified the hunt. Suddenly, ordinary people from Utah to New York began reporting suspicious strangers. The FBI's tip line rang off the hook. False leads skyrocketed. Some claimed they recognized the man's glasses. Others were sure they'd seen that stoic profile in a neighbor, co-worker, or a brooding stranger in a bus station. Every major newspaper and TV program ran the sketch, their tone both urgent and bewildered. For the growing Unabomber task force, already ballooning in size and burned out on mounting failures, this focus also helped. They could now cross-reference physical descriptions, track unusual purchases at hardware stores, check DMV records, and piece together a more structured cross-sectional list of potential suspects. Yet, as with everything about the Unabomber, nothing was straightforward. The man in the famous police sketch became something of a folk villain, a symbol of the faceless nature of random violence in modern America. Have you seen this man? Posters begot urban legends and sent more than a few innocent men into ambushes of suspicion. He was sighted everywhere and nowhere at once, riding subways, loitering in airports, camping in deserted woods. Police spent resources chasing stories that evaporated as quickly as they arose. For the people targeted by the Unabomber, the professors on edge every time the mail cart rattled down the hall, the airline executives hiring private security, the students telling what-if stories late at night, the sketch was both relief and curse. Relief because it made evil seem at least partly comprehensible and contained. Curse because no one could escape the feeling that the stranger next to them in the grocery line might be the man behind the mirrored shades. The emergence of the first portrait also had a psychological ripple that law enforcement, at first, hadn't foreseen. It forced the Unabomber himself to adapt. After the Salt Lake City episode and the release of the now iconic sketch, incidents abruptly ceased. For nearly 6 years, the country's most notorious serial bomber appeared to go silent. Whether he was lying low, perfecting new methods, or taunting the FBI by letting them stew in uncertainty, is something that will forever be debated. Several FBI agents believed that coming close to capture forced the Unabomber to reassess risks and burrow deeper into shadows. At the same time, the sketch marked a watershed for the investigation's PR and technological approaches. No longer content with dropping posters off at bus terminals, the FBI coordinated a nationwide and even international push for leads using television, newspaper, and radio, enlisting the American public as an extension of their manhunt. Local police forces updated their protocols on suspicious packages, and corporations held workshops on recognizing behavioral clues in their customers and colleagues, all using the sketch as a focal point. The campaign was sometimes criticized for sowing paranoia, as any lone man in sunglasses soon found out, but it also raised a collective vigilance that, for many, fostered a sense of participation in the fight against terror. The enduring image of the Unabomber composite sketch, still etched in the FBI's most wanted archives and public memory, represents a peculiar crossroads in American criminal history. It's not simply a portrait of a suspect, but the visual embodiment of a collective anxiety that had, until that point, felt unseeable and unknowable. And while this breakthrough ultimately led to years of frustrating dead ends, as the Unabomber disappeared into self-imposed exile, its psychological impact would outlast its immediate investigative usefulness. In essence, the creation and circulation of the first Unabomber sketch changed the entire tenor of the hunt. From an invisible adversary came a challenge to vigilance itself. Evil, now given a face, could be anyone, anywhere, and it would take not just authorities but an entire nation's eyes to root it out. Letters and manifestos that determined fate. The 1990s brought an unnerving twist to the hunt for the Unabomber, one that would forever change the course of the investigation and arguably the public's relationship with technology, radical thought, and the very concept of safety. Until this point, the Unabomber had been a spectral menace, a faceless genius lurking behind every package, a wraith whose motives were hidden beneath layers of violence and riddles. It was through his letters and, most notably, his now infamous manifesto, that the Phantom was finally forced into the light, and an entire nation was compelled to confront the depth and complexity of his anger. The first waves of communication didn't come as conventional threats. The Unabomber, whose bombs had shattered lives and sown panic for nearly 2 decades, began peppering newspapers, academics, and law enforcement agencies with lengthy typewritten letters. These weren't the scrawled ramblings of a madman, they were chillingly articulate, structured, argumentative, and meticulously reasoned. The letters were full of demands and philosophical musings, painting a portrait not just of a terrorist, but of a disaffected intellectual with a singular focus, condemning the encroachment of industrial society and technological progress on the autonomy of the individual. These letters did more than claim responsibility. They issued a challenge. The Unabomber threatened continued carnage unless his voice was heard nationwide. The demand was unprecedented. If a major outlet would publish a sprawling essay entitled "Industrial Society and Its Future," all violence would cease. This offer thrust government officials, FBI negotiators, and media executives into uncharted waters. Should the country negotiate with a terrorist who had already killed and maimed, or risk more violence by ignoring his request? Editorial boards convened late into the night, agonizing over the ethical boundaries of lending their pages to a murderer, even one who masked his threats beneath layers of ideology and critique. The decision to print the manifesto was, in itself, a moment of national drama. FBI officials played a delicate game of public relations and criminal psychology. Some feared that publication would inspire copycats or legitimize the bomber's twisted logic. Others, analyzing every phrase, believed the writings might hold the key to identification. They spoke in a unique cadence, blending rigorous academic references with the kind of yearning and alienation born from isolation. To the surprise of many, the Unabomber's ideas, however radical and deeply troubling, came wrapped in the language of revolution, not incoherence. The work was at once a screed and a confession, a challenge and a thesis. On September 19, 1995, the world watched as the New York Times and the Washington Post, in joint coordination with law enforcement, published the full text of the Unabomber Manifesto. Across the country, Americans could read for themselves the mind at the heart of the terror, paragraph after paragraph decrying industrial progress, mechanization, surveillance, and the loss of individual freedom. The author cast himself as a prophet warning against the ever-tightening grip of systems, technological, bureaucratic, and economic, that threatened to extinguish the wild autonomy of the human spirit. The effect on the investigation was immediate and profound. By unveiling his ideology to millions, the Unabomber surrendered the greatest weapon any fugitive possesses: anonymity. The manifesto was circulated by academics, scrutinized by linguistics experts, and pored over by would-be codebreakers and concerned citizens alike. Its tone, simultaneously professorial and wrathful, rang familiar with more than one reader, but most notably with the bomber's own family. David Kaczynski, the Unabomber's younger brother, had long harbored a gnawing suspicion that his estranged sibling, Ted, might have been responsible for the mysterious packages and the blight of violence that followed them. But it was the precise language, haunting turns of phrase, and philosophical fixations in the manifesto that finally shattered the dam of denial. Alongside his wife, David painstakingly compared the manifesto to old family letters and essays, old college missives, arguments about technology, complaints about the system, until the echoes were impossible to ignore. The uniquely logical, mathematical style, a particular resentment toward modernity, even the structure of the arguments. It all undeniably pointed to Ted. David faced an agonizing dilemma. The man behind these chilling words was a brother he'd once idolized, a Harvard-educated genius, a math prodigy who had retreated from the world after a string of personal breakdowns and chosen to live in absolute isolation in a Montana shack. But with the fate of more innocent lives in the balance, David and his wife ultimately made the gut-wrenching decision to alert authorities, providing evidence only after gaining assurance Ted would not face the death penalty. What followed was perhaps one of the most remarkable and tragic betrayals in the annals of American criminal justice. A family's loyalty torn between love and the greater good. Meanwhile, the publication of the manifesto did more than simply unmask the killer. It provoked a nationwide debate that continues to this day. On talk radio, in universities, and in op-ed columns, readers wrestled with a singularly American paradox. The violence was inexcusable, but the critique of technological oppression hit home for many. Some saw in the Unabomber a figure reminiscent of literary radicals or modern-day Cassandras. Others viewed him rightly as nothing but a terrorist. The line between criminal pathology and social critique became bewilderingly blurred. For the FBI, it was the biggest break in a case that had spanned nearly 2 decades. The manifesto, a confession in all but name, offered the best lead they'd ever have. Forensic linguists and criminal profilers pounced on the published text. Every idiosyncratic phrase, regional colloquialism, and intellectual reference was mapped, dissected, and compared to thousands of documents, letters, technical articles, academic treatises. The effort was relentless, blending the hard science of forensic analysis with the interpretive skill of literary criticism. In the end, it wasn't high-tech sleuthing or an informant network that cracked the case. It was the meticulous parsing of words and worldview. The Unabomber's lexicon was as distinctive as a fingerprint. The deluge of leads that followed the manifesto's publication was staggering. The FBI call center fielded tips from across the nation, former colleagues from university days, neighbors who recalled odd behavior, even amateur sleuths scouring the manifesto for hidden codes. Most went nowhere, but the pattern was set. Language, not bombs, held the key. David Kaczynski's tip, backed by an archive of Ted's writings from childhood on, provided the decisive link. Investigators quietly tracked Ted to his remote Montana cabin, gathering evidence until they were sure beyond a reasonable doubt that they had finally cornered the infamous Unabomber. But the saga of the letters and the manifesto did not end with handcuffs. The trial and aftermath raised questions about mental illness, personal autonomy, the reach of law enforcement, and above all, the power of ideas. Ted Kaczynski's writings, meant to unnerve, expose, and threaten, wound up serving as the ironclad proof of his identity and the undoing of his decade-long campaign. Words, it turned out, could be as deadly and ultimately as revealing as any technological device. Unmasking a genius, from Harvard prodigy to America's most elusive terrorist. The unmasking of the Unabomber was a revelation that shook the United States to its core, not only for the end of a more than 17-year manhunt, but for what it revealed beneath the savage anonymity, the face of a man who had once been hailed as a rare intellectual luminary. Few expected that the mastermind behind a series of calculated and devastating mail bombings would turn out to be Theodore John Kaczynski, the same Ted who had as a boy captivated professors and outpaced peers at Harvard University with astonishing mathematical acumen. Kaczynski's story is a paradoxical tale that veers terrifyingly between brilliance and tragedy. Born in 1942 in Chicago to a working-class family, Ted was recognized early as an intellectual outlier. By age 16, he had skipped multiple grades, and it was to Harvard, one of the world's most elite universities, that the teenage prodigy found himself transported. But the campus that should have nurtured the promise of the future became, in hindsight, the crucible for Ted's unraveling. In the late 1950s, Harvard was not merely an academic haven. It was the site of bizarre psychological experiments, some covertly funded, where young students were unwittingly subjected to profound emotional and intellectual stress. Ted was among those selected for such projects, notably ones engineered to break down ego and push participants into crisis. Years later, he would reveal a harrowing sense that these experiences scarred him more than anyone had realized. Ted's trajectory after Harvard seemed perfectly calibrated for greatness. He earned a Ph.D. in mathematics from the University of Michigan, producing a dissertation so advanced it was said only a handful of scholars could fully comprehend it. By age 25, he was the youngest assistant professor ever hired by the University of California, Berkeley's mathematics department, a mind among minds. And yet, Ted's prodigious talents were counterbalanced by a deepening social withdrawal. He found human relationships confounding, taught only a few semesters with growing discomfort, and ultimately resigned, leaving academia and its structured world behind for reasons both personal and philosophical. The cracks in the facade widened over the next several years. Ted's personal letters, later unearthed by journalists and the FBI, reveal a man growing ever more distrustful and isolated, haunted by suspicions about technology and the erosion of individual freedom. He drifted jobless for a period, lived at home with his parents in suburban Illinois, and eventually made a decisive break with society. In 1971, Ted bought a plot of land near Lincoln, Montana, building for himself a small, primitive cabin, roughly the size of a shed. It was here, in the rugged solitude of the Rocky Mountains, that the seeds of the Unabomber would take root and blossom, far from the lecture halls where he was once the golden boy of American mathematics. What followed was a descent into isolation that warped Ted's intellect against the very society that had once celebrated him. Newspaper clippings tacked to the cabin wall, cryptic diaries, and blueprints for homemade explosives became the haunting artifacts of a mind at war with the world. Through years of self-imposed exile, Ted survived on odd jobs, handouts from his family, and the most basic subsistence farming. But his true obsession was neither hunting nor home repair. It was his rallying personal manifesto against what he deemed the dehumanizing march of industrial technological progress. Between the late 1970s and mid-1990s, as recounted by both law enforcement and the media, Ted transformed his grievances into an infamous campaign of terror. With chilling patience and precision, he manufactured and mailed deadly devices to targets he associated with modern, technological slavery: university scholars, computer store owners, executives, and airlines. Yet even amid violence, the clues linking him to his past remained hidden. He was only ever glimpsed as a shadow, a mythos conjured on FBI wanted posters, always shown with sunglasses and hood, faceless amid the chaos he caused. The truth, when it was finally revealed by his younger brother David, was almost too strange for fiction. As the infamous Unabomber Manifesto was published in 1995 by the Washington Post and the New York Times, David recognized the distinctive cadence of Ted's argument. The same polemical tone, the mathematical rigor of logic, and the zealous anger that had colored familial correspondence for decades. More than linguistic familiarity, it was also the echo of Ted's philosophies and lifelong alienation, his warnings against centralized power, surveillance, and the erasure of human autonomy. David's moral struggle is now the stuff of American legend. Torn by loyalty and driven by fear of further violence, David and his wife provided authorities with Ted's old writings and biographical details, prompting the FBI to zero in on the Montana cabin. Their agony over betraying flesh and blood for the greater good brought into stark relief the human cost running beneath news headlines and legal proceedings. The arrest itself was both anticlimactic and singularly shocking. When agents swarmed the cabin in April 1996, they discovered a haggard figure whose appearance, wiry beard, dirty clothes, piercing blue eyes, had grown feral from years of ascetic solitude. The once celebrated prodigy was now frail but defiant, surrounded by an arsenal of bomb parts, coded notebooks, hundreds of pages of philosophical writings, and a copy of his completed manifesto. Ted was read his rights, and the news flashed across the country. The Unabomber, the solitary fugitive who left a nation trembling, was not a monster conjured from nowhere, but the creation of both brilliance and a lifetime's worth of wounds. During his trial, Kaczynski fiercely resisted any argument that invoked mental illness as mitigation, demanding to represent himself and seeking to validate his message as one of philosophical protest. While prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, Ted finally pled guilty to all charges in exchange for life imprisonment without parole. The criminal proceedings closed, but the aftershocks left society wrestling with questions neither judge nor jury could resolve. How does a mind so promising turn to darkness? What does it mean when the pursuit of justice is won by family heartbreak rather than fingerprints or DNA? Today, the image of Ted Kaczynski serves as both cautionary tale and societal mirror. Here was a man who, in another reality, might have become a pioneer in mathematics or a voice of innovation. Instead, he is entombed in history as America's most infamous homegrown terrorist, a solitary genius who weaponized his intellect to inflict suffering for what he perceived as a higher cause. His legacy is inextricably tied to both his mathematical brilliance and the alienation that metastasized into violence, igniting urgent debates about the boundary between genius and madness, the responsibilities of scientific progress, and the silent casualties of ambition left unchecked. The Harvard prodigy's transformation into a symbol of contemporary dread is a saga whose complexity continues to fascinate, horrify, and provoke a nation to examine where we find and so easily lose our sense of purpose, belonging, and moral clarity. The conclusion of the largest manhunt in the United States: the truth and the cost of fear. For nearly 2 decades, the Unabomber had haunted the American imagination, a faceless architect of terror whose homegrown campaign left scars across universities, airlines, families, and the FBI itself. When federal agents at last descended on a remote Montana cabin in the spring of 1996, the sense of finality that swept the country was almost palpable. Yet the end of the manhunt marked not just the capture of a singular criminal but the dawning realization of what the United States had risked, lost, and, perhaps most chilling of all, retained in its collective psyche. The cabin, when breached, was an artifact of paranoia and relentless focus. Agents found not only handmade explosives and meticulous blueprints, but a jumbled library of manifestos, coded diaries, and personal philosophies. Old newspaper clippings, scavenged electronics, and self-fashioned tools crowded the cramped space, a physical manifestation of the mind that had orchestrated a nationwide reign of fear with nothing more than patience and ingenuity. For law enforcement, the relief was monumental. But in quiet ways, the experience transformed their approach to crime, terrorism, and the meaning of safety in everyday life. The arrest of Ted Kaczynski, the infamous Unabomber, unfolded far from the drama of his crimes. Disheveled and gaunt, he looked more like an eccentric recluse than a mythic villain. Still, his capture was broadcast into living rooms across America, and for a brief moment it felt as if a long nightmare might be finally ending. However, as investigators cataloged the evidence and the reality of the case filtered out, new questions replaced old fears. How had a single individual managed to evade an army of pursuers for so long? What unspoken vulnerabilities in American society had he laid bare? And what ultimately had the nation sacrificed in its urgent quest for justice? The legal reckoning that followed was tense, unique, and at times excruciating for both victims and audience. Prosecutors brought an overwhelming case, grounded not just in forensics but in journals, letters, and a personalized philosophy of resistance to modernity. The mountain of evidence made Kaczynski's guilt undeniable, yet the depth of his alienation and the consistency of his argument against technological slavery challenged even the severest critics. Ted refused efforts to declare him insane. He was, in his view, a rational actor in an irrational world. In the end, to avoid the death penalty, he pled guilty and accepted life in a maximum security prison, isolated yet unrepentant to the last. The trial and its aftermath forced the nation into new reckoning with fear. During those decades of uncertainty, Americans had changed, subtly, enduringly. Mailrooms had become fortresses rather than communal spaces. Everyday routines, opening a package, boarding a flight, walking onto a college campus, had taken on new undertones of suspicion and protocol. Law enforcement, pushed by the magnitude and cunning of the Unabomber investigation, had learned to blend behavioral profiling, forensics, and, crucially, psychological warfare in their pursuit of domestic threats. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit became a model for later cases, from Oklahoma City to homegrown extremism in the digital age. But the price of victory was always more than legal closure. The era left behind a population wide awake to danger in unexpected places. For many, the intrusion of paranoia into daily life could not be undone by handcuffs or guilty pleas. Teachers warily eyed their mail, executives double-checked every delivery, even children grew up with a new strain of caution, a fear of the unknown that seeped into holiday mornings and birthday packages alike. Media coverage had played an outsized role, amplifying both the reach and the mystique of terror. Every update during the manhunt, every glimpse of the FBI's elusive composite sketch became embedded in the nation's memory. But in analyzing the events, journalists, academics, and even the public began to debate the tension between vigilance and hysteria, between transparency and sensationalism. Had the coverage warned and empowered, or merely stoked further panic and fascination? Communities, too, faced lingering aftershocks. Survivors told stories not only of injury or trauma but of resilience, communal effort, and eventually new frameworks for recovery. Support groups, changes to campus security, and trauma counseling became the new normal. Yet for some victims and their families, closure remained elusive. Legal justice, while satisfying on paper, could not restore lost limbs, loved ones, or the certainty that the next knock at the door might be innocent. Meanwhile, a generation of law enforcement professionals went forth forever changed. The manhunt for the Unabomber was a crucible, testing the limits of cooperation, patience, and the boundaries between state power and individual rights. Innovations in psychological profiling, information sharing, and database management were born from both the failures and successes of the search. Later, these would prove critical in myriad post-9/11 investigations and the war on terror. On a deeper level, the Unabomber case lingers in debates over mental illness, social isolation, and the fissures opened by rapid technological change. Ted Kaczynski's legacy is one of violence, certainly, but also a mirror held to the vulnerabilities of a society obsessed with innovation, yet unprepared for its human toll. Philosophers and social critics still grapple with his manifesto years after his capture, debating its warnings about dehumanization and surveillance, even as they utterly condemn the crimes that carried its message forward. In the end, The final curtain on America's greatest manhunt did not restore a lost innocence. If anything, it introduced a lasting skepticism, an understanding that the most profound threats may come not from outside enemies, but from within the shadows of the ordinary. The price of fear was measured in more than police overtime or legal costs. It was paid day by day, in freedom subtly relinquished, routines unthinkingly altered, and a nation's slow accommodation to the reality that not all monsters live only in fairy tales. For better or worse, the era of the Unabomber reset American consciousness, and when the dust settled, the knowledge remained. History's greatest terrors leave legacies no trial can erase, and the scars of fear, once etched, rarely fade completely.